ecosystem services, I think, are even more important than just carbon. Ecosystem services are all of the things that a soil provides. So the productivity, yes. Water filtration, yes. Air quality ties into that, like I just said. So it's related to everything.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show. I'm your host, Leo Bastos, Assistant Professor in Integrative Precision Agriculture at the University of Georgia. Today, we welcome our guest, Dr. DeAnn Presley. She's a professor at Kansas State University in Environmental Soil Science and Soil Management. DeAnn, welcome to the Crop Science Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's awesome to have you here today. To start things off, I would like to ask you if you could share with us your path, how you got to your position today, and how was that process?
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm in Iowa, a small farm. We had mostly livestock, a lot of hogs and several other species, but mostly hogs. And I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, but I went to Iowa State and eventually found my way into agronomy and graduated from Iowa State. And about the time I was about done there as an undergrad, I was like, hey, what's this grad school thing about? And I talked to some professors and went and visited some universities. And I don't know if anybody knows Dr. Mickey Ransom. He's a wonderful soil scientist who has retired from our department. He said, hey, you're looking at grad school. You should come visit Kansas State. And so I did, and it was awesome, and I've never left. So I came for a master's, and then about the time I was done with my master's, I said, hey, can I do I started thinking about a PhD, and he was like, you can stay here if you want. So I did. And then about the time that I was working on my master's or my PhD, an opening became available in this department. I said, hey, can I apply? I didn't think I would get an interview, and I surely didn't think I would get the job, but here I am. So I started in 2007 as an assistant professor, and now I'm a full professor. So it can happen. Yeah, I know you're early on in that process, but it can
Yeah.
happen. And so I've been here ever since. And so I love soils the most, but I've also done parts of my path. I did some weed science, and I used to work a lot in plant pathology as an undergrad, and also done some plant breeding. I was a soybean breeder for a little while. But it always comes back to soils for me. I just think that soils are just the foundation of everything in ag, and I find them fascinating, and I love to study them here and around the world.
Nice. That's fantastic. I guess for our guests, I was at K-State before, so I met DeAnn previously, and I did not know of all this rich path and experiences that you had until making your way into your position and then developing things from that point. So that's really, really exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just in my case, an accident. But people sometimes say, compare and contrast Iowa versus Kansas. And I'm like, well, where I grew up in Iowa, it was a lot of hogs and corn and soybeans. And Kansas is like that, only with a huge precipitation gradient and a lot more beef animals and a lot more different crops. The different crops is what I think really makes Kansas fascinating to me is we have a lot of wheat, but we also have corn and soybeans. And then we have sorghum, and we have cotton and sunflowers and everything else. So we have canola, alfalfa, and then cover crops, which is one of the areas where I spend a lot of my time. So with being a soil scientist, I work across all of those crops, and I actually work with hog producers, beef producers, and sometimes some poultry producers too. So it's really fun. I just love working across everything.
Nice. And that's really interesting because I feel like many times in the U.S. or in the Midwest U.S. states, we really don't see that much diversity in crop production systems and just, I guess, different types of crops. And yeah, Kansas is a little bit different in that way where we do have all that diversity.
Yeah, and plus we have a 50-50 split with about half of our land is cropland and half is pasture land, which is, of course, very important for livestock production, too. And so I do a whole lot of soil sampling for my projects, and I spend about half of it on pasture land and half in cropland, and it's just great. I love being outside soil sampling. It's my most favorite thing.
Nice. That's awesome. DeAnn, could you share with us a little bit of what you're currently working on, especially, so you mentioned cover crops and then all these different cash crop options as
Yeah.
well?
So almost all the research projects I have, which I actually have a three-way split. So I do both teaching and extension and research, but it's all very integrated, and almost everything I do revolves around looking at soil health and measures of soil health, and how do our management practices contribute to that, and then how do those support production ag. So I always think, with any system, we could probably do something a little bit better. And also, I like to measure those things and see, okay, so for example, carbon, it's a bit hot topic. We can come back to that at some point if you like and talk about carbon markets and all of those things. But soil carbon is not really anything anybody quick cares about, quote unquote, except everybody cares about soil organic matter, and every field can benefit from having more soil organic matter pretty much. And so I say nobody cares about it, but I don't really mean it. When I say that, I don't mean it that way. What I mean is nobody buys and sells carbon per se. Yes, I guess there are markets, but people buy and sell pounds of beef, or bushels of corn, or bushels of soybeans, or whatever, and that's the underpinning of everything. So more organic matter almost leads to more productivity all the time. And so those are just the sorts of measurements that I think are important to make. And not just that, but also the other ecosystem services. For example, over the past weekend we had a lot of, I think we were gusting to over 60-mile-an-hour winds. And so any of our fields that had been tilled recently, we had a lot of soil loss. And so that's going to be an air quality and potentially a human health issue down the road, and just a loss of productivity from those fields. So, ecosystem services, I think, are even more important than just carbon. Ecosystem services are all of the things that a soil provides. So, the productivity, yes. Water filtration, yes. Air quality ties into that, like I just said. So, it's related to everything.
And that's really interesting because I think that if someone has never thought of it that way, of like, okay, we have soil, we have carbon, we have plants that are contributing carbon to the soil, and all those interactions there, and really thinking not just, as you said very well, not just the soil carbon going in or the carbon going to the soil, but also the other benefits that it provides to us, which a lot of times is really tough to put of like an actual monetary value on it. Nonetheless, it's super important, right? So
Very hard to monetize in a way. And then sometimes people say, well, you say that, but honestly, like, for example, I like to tell a story about the time my phone rang. My phone rings, and which my office phone almost never rings unless people call my cell phone. But my office phone rang, and somebody was like, "Hi, you're one of the people that does things with cover crops at K State." I said, "Yeah." And he was like, "Okay, I'm not interested in cover crops at all, but I have a field that won't stop eroding, and I really want to do something about it. What would you recommend?" And I was like, "Can I say cover crops?" And he was like, "Okay." So I said, "Well, what about planting, just the areas that are eroding with cover crops if you don't want to plant the rest of the field?" "Okay, great." And he hangs up, bye. So I just think it's one of those things that, um, and to finish that story, I also had somebody say once, he figured out how many hours he spends out, cleaning, you doing dirt work, quote unquote dirt work, to move soil back from where it came to where he wanted it. That we can monetize. So,
yeah.
people have problems that we could technically put a number on, but usually it's time savings. And I don't know of too many people that have extra time. So time is a huge resource.
Absolutely. No, that's really great point. Really, really great point. Um, so I wanted to follow up on that. So you did mention about so being in Kansas and other Midwestern states where you have this very large precipitation gradient, right?
Hmm.
So if we're thinking of cover crop adoption and just testing how that fits into different systems, could you speak a little bit about that in Kansas and what type of experiences you've been having with growers that are adopting cover crops across that gradient of precipitation and some of the success stories you've been seeing on the ground?
Yeah. So the first conversation with any grower always needs to be about what do you want to do with the cover crop? Is it about erosion, or is it about grazing, or whatever? What do they want to do? I did just check the 2022 Census of Ag data. It was actually a reporter that called me not long ago that said, "Hey, the Census of Ag data from 2022 comes out. It always comes out 2 years later, so it just came out." He said, "Kansas only has 700 and some thousand acres of cover crops," and I was like, "Oh, that's more than the 500 and some thousand we had 5 years ago." And he said, "Kansas is not adopting cover crops as fast as many other states." And I was like, well, we have this strong precipitation gradient here. And so I think we also, generally speaking, probably have some fairly conservative farmers. You got to think about risk, you have to think about profit, you have to think about all of these things. There are a great number of different programs that are incentives out there right now to help people get started with the cover crop. But most people don't just go sprinting out there and plant 1,000 acres of something the first year. If they do it, it's something that they might do 40 acres, 80 acres, 160 acres of a small area to see how do I like it? What does it add in terms of complexity? And what benefit did I get? And so I just think that more is good. It's great that we have more, but I think also you, it's just like anything else. More for the sake of more is not the goal. More for the sake of, honestly, what if everybody just planted one pass around the outside of their field? That would actually be a great thing, maybe for conservation. Or so I just think it should make sense spatially where people put them, and also make sense for them for their operation. Somebody asked me not long ago about what fraction I think of the cover crops in Kansas are grazed versus how many of them are just grown as just a cover. I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know that anybody would have that statistic, but I bet you 75 to 80% of them are grazed in Kansas. If I had to guess, we're number 3 in beef cattle in the United States. And so it's just part of what we do. On the eastern side of the state, a lot of those cover crops are getting grazed. So it's a cover crop going after, so it'll be after corn, before beans, where we've got a cover crop. And so pretty typically, so that's a fairly easy system, and I should say an acceptable system to a lot of people. But as we go farther to the west, to the middle of the state and to the west part of the state, the number of total acres of cover crops is going to drop off rapidly as the precipitation gradient goes down. So we on our for any of the viewers here, the very southeast part of Kansas gets over 40 inches of rain. Where I'm in Manhattan, which is northeast Kansas, gets about 35, 36 inches of rain, and then it drops off really fast as we go to the Colorado border, all the way down to 14 inches of rain. And so, yes, irrigation, that is something that is, of course, a piece of the pie. But as far as acres of irrigation or acres of cover crop, is far higher for adoption on the east side than it is the west, just because of moisture. If we had more moisture, we'd be so happy, but we just don't.
Absolutely, and that's a really great point. That really any grower thinking of adopting cover crops, or any other crop for that matter, is going to be thinking on that trade off of, okay, I'm going to plant this crop, which is going to require water, and if that water is going to then run short on my next crop, which is the one I actually make my profit on, that balance is going to be really important to make sure that they're not running short on the crop that gives the monetary benefit, I guess, even though that cover crop may provide other benefits that are hard to put a money value on it.
Yeah, but then back to the grazing, pounds of beef is something we can monetize. And so, again, that's might be something people are willing to take a slightly lower yield if it makes them a total of more money at the end of the year. So it's just I've gotten to the point now where instead of having a talk to 100 farmers, I'd rather speak individually to 100 farmers so I can come up with the best answer for them. Because the first question I'll say is, well, where are you located? Where are you farming? What kinds of soils do you have? What kind of crops are you growing? Do you have animals or not? And then from there, we can start to drill down into a good conversation.
Yeah, so no silver bullet solution. It has to be very tailored to that system, that environment. Yeah.
And if it's upland, that's more clay versus if it's bottom ground, that's more silty or something. Like, totally matters.
Yeah, absolutely. So you did mention earlier about carbon credits and carbon markets. Could you share your experience with that, and what are you seeing, or is the growers are facing now, and how are they responding to that?
Yeah, so there's just a proliferation of different market options out there for people. So there's many choices. There are some that's the focus. That's what they do is carbon markets, and then there's many that are integrated within all the big service providers and input sellers for agriculture. So your Bayers and Syngentas, Cortevas, and all of the just so many different companies have some kind of carbon market and built in now. So and So there's these scores, there's these what are they called? ESJ scores, environmental social justice scores. For any publicly traded company, they'll have an ESJ score. So you could look it up for Deere or Ford or whoever, look up their ESJ score. And so sorry, I said ESJ, but I meant ESG, Environmental Social Governance score. And so, and funny thing is I learned about this from my graduate student who is really into trading. He's really into stocks and things like that. And then a few days later, I heard it from an undergrad student, and then I had to go look it up and say, okay, what is this all about? So every day I learn something at my job from students, and which is great. So anyways, with these companies, they all have these scores, and, so I just took a drink of Diet Coke here. Probably wasn't supposed to do that on the podcast, but all of these companies, if they would like to decrease their carbon footprint or their environmental footprint, they would need to buy some offsets from somebody else in order to do that. And so I think that's right now farmers are interested. They're saying, yeah, there's all these programs. They're getting a barrage of, calls and emails and mailers from all these different companies. And then how do they choose one to go with? And I would say fine print is very important. See what you're getting into. What do they want you to do? And how long is that commitment? Because if you're doing this on rented ground, and if that commitment is longer than your rental contract, that might be complicated. So I think there's just a lot of questions that exist in that space. But then the other thing is we know the practices should work. So certain practices, usually it's going to be no-till, fertility management. It's going to be cover crops. It might be planting, if somebody wanted to do a permanent grass or woodland planting, that could be part of this as well. So these practices should sequester more carbon and store more carbon. And that's what my research is all about is, okay, so we planted cover crops. Did we store more carbon? How much more? And how long did it take to do that? And does that match what the model prediction values say? I work with a lot of modelers since I said like my favorite thing is to go collect soil cores, then I give that data to modelers to help improve their models to make that work better and also make sure that the certainty is getting pretty good. But there are a number of these different programs, and most of the people that I've met that have signed up with one, they've signed up with a choice because, well, they were doing something with that service provider anyway, and they trusted that service provider or that advisor, and they chose that particular program. But as far as if anybody's watching this and they're thinking about it, like, I think the world's still your oyster. I think there's going to be options to sell your carbon credits to many different companies for years to come. So if you're sitting on the fence, I think that's probably an okay place to be until you decide which program you really want to go with.
Awesome. And so you're saying that there's this complexity on the market right now is with many companies perhaps offering different terms, different contracts, different values to be given for the credit. So how are growers making sense of all that complexity that is coming, like a new complexity, I guess, coming to their table?
Honestly, I don't know that they are. I mean, so I've said to farmer, I think at one point I looked and there was about 15 different markets, and then I keep seeing new things getting added. And so I bet that number is well over 20. The other day somebody said they thought it was over 30. And I'm like, it could be. So I would just say that I don't know that anybody's making sense of it right now. I talked to somebody the other day and they were like, oh, well, these companies will probably just buy each other up and eventually they'll end up with like the big three. And I'm like, well, that could be. So yeah, I just think that I think the big thing that I think anybody in extension would care about is how does that money flow back to a farmer, and does it really, does the cost of changing a practice, are they benefited by that new practice, by that money flowing in, or savings, or is it making their life easier, things like that. So we want to see the cost, the benefit. We want the benefit to outweigh the cost for sure of a change, and so how this all goes, it's going to be interesting. I've heard it referred to as the Wild West, and maybe that's a bit dramatic for carbon, but I think it's important.
Yeah, and that's a really important piece, because if a farmer is going to change their management to include new crops, maybe more passes on the field to manage that crop, to implement the crop, yeah, you would wish that at least whatever they're getting paid for it would offset that cost plus get a little bit of extra money to really incentivize that, right?
Right. And
Yeah,
nutrient management is a big piece of that as well. So it's one of the quickest bangs for the buck in terms of the fact that if that nitrogen fertilizer never has to get made from natural gas to begin with. So if we are more efficient with fertilizer placement, use, and all the things, then that's one of the quickest returns. And it actually would have a significant environmental impact. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it. It's not just cover crops, it's not just no till. There's even rotational grazing and better grazing strategies that can go into that too. So there's a lot of different options. It just depends on what makes sense for that particular farming operation.
absolutely. So let me ask you this: if I am a grower that have been doing many of these practices for a long time, and I want to get compensated for having already this history of doing this, all of these beneficial practices that help to sequester carbon in the soil, compared to a grower that maybe has very little adoption of that, or maybe not even adopting any of those management practices, how does the market see those two different growers when they come looking for being compensated for their credits?
That's a great question. And it's one of those sort of, unfairness factors that people say, oh, it's not fair. My kids, when they fight, they're like, it's not fair. Well, it's not fair. So if there's somebody that's been sitting here not changing a practice and they're like, okay, now I'm going to change practice, they actually could end up gaining the most. Um, but I think big picture, they've probably have given up a lot of profit over the years too by not switching to different strategies. And so there are a few of the carbon programs that have a look back period. So they'll look back like 3 years in the past. They might pay you for 3 years of no till, like past no till or past cover crops or things like that. But what I've heard from a lot of really progressive farmers that have been doing no till and or cover crops or whatever the practice might be, so where's an opportunity to enter this market? Well, it's with a new piece of ground that they maybe take on and rent or buy. So it's a piece, so it might be because all of these things are done on a parcel by parcel by parcel basis. So you'd sign up this field and do all the paperwork. You'd sign up this field and do all the paperwork, this field. And so when you acquire new fields, which I mean, that's what's kind of happening all through agriculture. Farm sizes are generally getting larger, number of farmers are decreasing. But if somebody starts renting or if they buy a new piece of land to them and it's always been conventionally tilled or whatever, and they start doing these practices, they can definitely realize that on that land. But as far as on it, most things are going to require a new practice in order to get an incentive payment. And I will say, not incentive, I should say that for carbon market payments, incentive payments, that's a little bit different sort of thing. But there are a number of the different climate smart commodities grants that have now, those would have all been funded. Well, last year, I think, is when they were all funded, and now that money is starting to flow in. So I know there's more than 25 different opportunities that Kansas farmers would have to sign up. A big one that I know a little bit about is through National Sorghum Producers. They got a large grant. And so sorghum producers through signing up to do like nutrient management or tillage practices or cover crops with that um, is another opportunity. So it's not even carbon specific, it's climate smart agriculture. So conserving water, perhaps using less pesticides, maybe. um, but there's just a lot of different, and that's all federal government money, of course, flowing in through the climate smart commodities. Climate smart commodities program. So it's not just tied to cover crops or no-till, but there's just so many options right now. So I think it almost might be overwhelming. And the reason I know that there's more than 25 is because the Kansas Association of Conservation Districts said, hey, there's more than 25, and we should try to do something educational for Kansas farmers so we have something intelligent to say when they're like, which one should I choose? I'm like, extension, we're never going to say do this or do that. We're going to say, well, these are your options. These are the things that I see, and this is what I know. So these are your choices. We don't ever tell anybody do this or do that. But yeah, so I don't know. I feel like I said a whole lot of nothing right there. I'm sorry, but it's just where we are right now. There's so many choices.
Yeah, and it's all, I mean, it's all relatively new, right? So it's keeps evolving as well. So it's a complexity that, I mean, growers are facing, and also universities are trying, especially in extension,
Hmm.
trying to help them parse all that information and those new terms and new concepts coming in. And yeah, it's definitely a moving target.
Yeah, I think most of us would view it as like when you're eating ice cream and you put the whipped cream and the cherry on top, I mean, like you should already be, these practices should make sense to you. So they're the bowl of ice cream. They should be beneficial to you anyway. And then the whipped cream and cherry on top are just the extra money, the extra payment, I guess, for doing this, the carbon market programs, that kind of thing. It's extra, but it's probably not really the main benefit. So really it's risk management. Really it's capturing profit. Sometimes people say, how come there's like Kansas is over, I think we're at like 11 million acres of no-till now out of our 20-ish million acres of cropland. And I always say it's not because Kansas farmers are like, oh, we're the original no, we're conserving water. It's not about conserving soil or carbon. It's about conserving water because we're so darn short on that. So it drives it. And also, of course, Roundup Ready soybeans would have what really made this go from, sort of a fringe practice to so doable for everyone. So these innovations I think any of these things, all these conservation things, they need to make sense first financially, and then we can take some of these benefits.
Yeah, that's a really important mindset, and a different mindset perhaps of what some other people may have, right? As far as, well, I don't know, like if you're changing that to make sure that you can sell your carbon, yeah, maybe it's going to be a little bit tougher to make it work as compared to if you're already doing something that makes sense for that operation, that environment, and really just getting that extra benefit of getting paid for it as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great way of thinking of it.
It one of the ways we talk about this is also like, so big picture, like if you are an ethanol plant manufacturing ethanol and you want to sell ethanol to another state, most states it's like, okay, sell us your ethanol. But if you want to sell your ethanol into very particular markets like the California market, that has to have the carbon intensity score has to be acceptable to the California market to do that. And so that's where then certain entities like ethanol plants or maybe biodiesel plants eventually can start to say, well, we have these incentives that we're going to offer so that we can get our carbon intensity score down. But yeah, so then that trickles back to a farmer eventually. So some of those things make more sense than others, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Awesome. Well, DeAnn, we're getting towards the end of our episode, so that means we have our 3 personal questions that we like to ask all of our guests.
It's time for our famous 3. Explore the future of agriculture with KWS, a global leader in innovation and sustainable farming practices. Uncover the exceptional qualities of our hybrid rye, cultivating a legacy for a greener tomorrow. Visit kws.com/US for more information and for dealer locations. KWS, seeding the future since 1856.
So I'll start off with asking you if you have any resources in agriculture or soils or crops or soil health, or really any technical resource that you have used that you find is useful and interesting that you may want to share with our audience.
Yeah. So there in the United States, we're really fortunate in that our soils have been mapped, right? We've had soil maps developed, and they were all developed a long time ago, and then they're under constant refinement. So thank you, USDA, for doing that. And so we've got Web Soil Survey that's available to anybody. Those maps can also be downloaded into anybody's GIS system. But then there's also something called Soil Web. So on Soil Web, I have actually made that a little, I bookmarked that on my phone so that wherever I am, if I'm like, I wonder what the soil's like here underneath my feet, I just use Soil Web and it tells me what the soil is underneath my feet. So that's one I love. And then another one I love as an extension person is sometimes you just get questions that you're like, I have no idea. So if you ask me right now, what is the typical chloride concentration of a soil in Kansas? I'd be like, let me go look. And so one of my go-to spots for that is the one I was thinking of is National Soil Survey Laboratory. So if you Google National Soil Survey Laboratory in Lincoln, Nebraska, you can pull up soil information from around the world. Really, they've got soil data in there from many different countries where projects have been done. Most of it's for the United States, though. And so if I'm looking for a teaching soil from Hawaii, I'll just pull up some soil information. So it'll have the description, it'll have information about the plants that are growing there, and then it'll have a ton of information about like texture and pH and sulfur and just anything you could want to know that they've collected that data on is there. And so I find that to just be an invaluable resource. And I show people this and they're like, how did I not know this exists? So there's a tip for people.
That's really awesome. And, I'm not being from the US and being here enough to know about some of these resources as well. I cannot stress enough of how fortunate we are in the US to have so many really great open source data, ag-related data that is collected through different agencies, including USDA, and made available. And really, the one that you said is one that I use a lot as well for my research, for my classes. It is a really invaluable resource. I'm super glad that you mentioned that. I think at least the guests I'm interviewing, you're the first one that brings that up, and it's really a great resource indeed.
I love it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. All right, so our next question here for you is basically the same question, but outside of the technical side of things. So, if you have any resource that you have found that is not ag related, not soils related, that you'd like to share with us.
It's a little bit adjacent, but CocoRa's. So CocoRa's is a website called the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. So it's CoCoRahs, CocoRa's, which I spell that out like that because it's one of these words that you're like, what? That's not a word. But CocoRa's is a website where people just go in and report their rain data or their precip data every day. And so I find that incredibly useful, not just for work, but also if I'm trying to decide, is it going to be wet where I'm going to watch that football game? Well, let me see what how much rain has had. And so now my husband, who has a business where he works outside, he's constantly looking at CocoRa's to find out where is it wet and where is it dry? Where can he go get in and where can he, how much have they had? Oh, and he looks it up. So I just find CocoRa's incredibly useful. So it's definitely ag adjacent, but it's meteorological data because we all know that there's weather stations, but CocoRa's is thousands of observers. I think they try to have 10,000 observers a day across the whole U.S. But it is one of these resources that once people start to use it, they're constantly in there saying, how much have we had? Did they have it over there? And then you start to it's fun sometimes. Like I remember one day, I think it was like 9 inches of rain. Somebody got 9 inches of rain in 24 hours. And I said something about that on Twitter. And the farmer who had that, he responded back. And we had a whole conversation about that. He was like, that was me. It had 9 inches of rain. It was insane. I mean, it was like this, rained sideways rain. It's like the Forrest Gump scene. It rained sideways. It rained up. But I love that website.
That's awesome. I have heard of that, but have not used yet. Maybe I'll start a new ag or ag adjacent related addiction as well on CocoRa's.
It's great, and anybody can become an observer too. So all you do is you just get one of their rain gauges, and you can work through your state meteorologist usually to get one for free because they want more observers. And then they have an app. So I just mine is at the end of my driveway. So when I pull out of my driveway every day, I'm like, didn't rain. So it's easy to put it. They want you to put it in a 0 so that there's data also saying, hey, it's 0.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's great. So when it rains, I can't wait to get up at 7 a.m. and go check my rain gauge and enter my data. It's the nerdiest thing, but it's awesome and so useful. Because we all know, I drive 20 miles to get to work, and definitely every time it rains, I bet you 95% of the time between when we're at my house and when I get to work, it may or may not have rained across that whole distance. Thunderstorms are so spatially variable, and so I think that's the whole point of this, to have spatial data.
That's awesome. So whenever you report it, it also gets your GPS location of where you are at the moment.
Yeah, I'm Pot County reporter. I don't remember what number I am. I want to say I'm Pot County reporter number 13 or something like that. I live in Pottawatomie County. So yeah, it is so fun. But yeah, there's an app and I log in. I forgot to log in my 0 for the day. I'm Pot County 22. I'm number 22. So I'm the 22nd person to sign up. In fact, I kind of fell off the map for a while and they said, hey, DeAnn, you haven't been reporting. And I was like, oh, I'll get back on that. So I've been trying to report for all of April and get back on it. But yep, 0, entered a 0. So in the past few days, we had 600s, 900s, and 500s. So it's been kind of a nice little run.
Yeah, that's right. So it's almost like Waze, reporting for Waze, but rather than traffic is rainfall. And
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Exactly, like when you're for yeah, exactly like in Google. I just showed my mother-in-law how to do that the other day. She was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm reporting a slowdown in traffic." She was like, "You can do that?" I'm like, That's how they get that stuff."
yeah, awesome. That's a great source. Thanks for sharing that. And I guess our last question for you today is, in your opinion, what types of skills or skill sets successful professionals apart in ag related professions?
Um, I I just think honesty and then follow through, which, honestly, sometimes I'm bad at follow through, but honesty is when you say, okay, I don't know, but let me see if I can find an answer. And then I go ask around and see who knows, walk around the hallways or call my friends and things like that. So honesty and follow through. So if somebody asks a question, I say, and maybe I've dropped the ball before where I've like, oh gosh, I see that person again like 10 days later. I'm like, okay, here's your answer. But just, I think those two things help out a lot. There's, you get busy at different points in your life, and so just being honest with people and there's a whole maybe saying no and not taking on too many things, but good luck. That's just not the world we live in today. So it just saying what you do know and what you don't know, and getting back to people and getting them the information, making sure that did that person help you. um, or did that person get back to you? Like if I've passed off, I think of an extension question like a football. I'm going to give it to somebody, and I want to make sure that the football has been given, truly received back to the person who answered the question or asked the question in the first place.
That's really great, and I think it's so refreshing to hear you say that, because a lot of times, in academia especially, some people with PhDs think that they know it all, and I really think it's awesome to have people with any type of training, but especially PhDs, because of that stigma to say, you know what, I don't know that, but I'll get to someone that knows it, and I'll get the answer back to you, sometime.
Yeah.
So I think that's really awesome.
Well, I always say with extension, so we're coworkers, you're my coworker. We all work for the people of the state and of whatever. And so we're coworkers, and federal tax, state and but taxpayer money. I don't all the money, right? And so that's the job. And so I don't think, unless we're like competing in a basketball tournament or competing for student tuition money, those are the two things we compete over. But after that, we're collaborators, we all work together. So that's, I think, the important thing is to be responsible stewards of people's taxpayer money, and then just do our very best to find the answer. We're not always going to have the answer before, I don't know, before a big company rolls out a new big product, and then we're like, oh, what do we know about it? We try to. I mean, that's really we try. We do a lot of research, usually hand in hand with those companies, but also there's times where something comes out and we're like, oh, we react, and just have to be honest about it and say, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Or I
Yeah,
don't know, but I'm going to go put plots in the ground, and away you go.
absolutely. Awesome. Well, thanks so much. It was really fantastic having you here with us, DeAnn, and I really appreciated the conversation, all of your thoughts, both on the technical side and also all of your tips. I was taking notes. I'm actually one of them I was already using. The other, well, the Kokora. So I'll definitely check that out. So thanks for sharing that.
So useful when we need to go to a place and you're like, did they have rain? Consult the Cocoa Ross.
Yeah.
It's so useful. I love
Absolutely.
it.
Well, thanks again. It was great having you here today. Really appreciate it. Thanks for your time. And yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much.